We're reading All Things Even Frisky. We are at chapter 15. Missing. Where is Jimmy? Ooh, that doesn't sound good. Uh-oh. All right. The soft summer breeze cooled Billy's hot face as he coasted down the street on his bike. He was tired after the Little League game, but happy. "We really smeared them," he said to himself as he guided the bike into the driveway. "I only struck out once this time and got 2 one-base hits, then walked the rest of the time." He could hardly wait to tell Aunt Kate. He glanced up at the basketball net as he parked his bike. If Aunt Kate didn't know any more about baseball than basketball, she wouldn't even know what one-base hits were, he thought, his face twisting into a grin. "Aunt Kate," he called as he burst into the back door, but there was no answer. "Wonder where Aunt Kate is," he mused. Last night's newspaper was spread out on the kitchen table. Billy suddenly remembered he hadn't read the comics the night before. As he turned the page, a headline caught his eye. "Escapee from mental hospital, still on the loose." He shivered. "I'm glad Dad is home nights now," he murmured. Billy finished the comics and ran outside. Where was Aunt Kate? He was hungry. He glanced over at the Parker's house. Was that a police car in front of their place? It certainly was. And that was a police officer at the door. Mrs. Parker was coming out of the house, now followed by her husband and Aunt Kate. Mrs. Parker was crying. "He was right here a few minutes ago, officer," she said. "I can't understand it. He's never run off before." "We'll have a search party organized in no time," Billy heard the officer say, "and it won't be long until we find your boy. Mr. Parker, you may come with me." "Aunt Kate, is Jimmy lost?" asked Billy in a hoarse whisper as the officer and Mr. Parker were leaving. Aunt Kate nodded. "Could I go and help look for him?" asked Billy. "I'm afraid not," answered Aunt Kate. "You run home and get my knitting basket, will you? I'm going to stay with Mrs. Parker and might just as well knit as sit idle." Billy felt a little insulted as he turned to go for the knitting basket. Why couldn't he look for Jimmy too? He was returning to the Parker house with Aunt Kate's knitting basket in his hand when Frisky attracted his attention. The pup was wriggling at the end of his chain, longing to get loose. An idea flashed into Billy's mind. "Wait a minute, Frisky. I'll be right back," he promised. Aunt Kate thanked him for bringing her the basket. "Make yourself a sandwich," she said, "and pray for Jimmy's safety. Remember how you felt when Frisky was lost?" Yes, Billy remembered. That's why he was going to try to do something about Jimmy's being lost. And Frisky was going to do something too. Billy closed the kitchen door carefully and looked around the small entryway. Sure enough, there was Jimmy's jacket. He hadn't worn it today because the weather was so warm. "Please, God, make it work," he prayed as he put the jacket under his arm and ran into his own house to call Pete. "Pete," Billy said breathlessly over the phone, "want to do some detective work with me?" "Sure." "The little boy next door is lost. You and I and Frisky can be a search party to try to find him. Maybe Frisky will be able to track him down. He's an awfully smart pup." "I'll be right over," answered Pete. In a few minutes, Pete rode into the yard on his bike. Together, Billy and Pete ran to the clothesline to release Frisky. Billy held Jimmy's jacket up to Frisky's nose. Frisky sniffed it, then began running around the yard in circles, excited to be free from his chain. "Here, Frisky," called Billy. "Come here and smell the jacket. Find Jimmy. Show us where to go." Frisky sniffed the jacket, then ran more circles around the boys. Billy was disappointed. "He's just a pup. I guess he doesn't know how to track anybody down." He looked at Pete, unsure of what to do next. "Smart detectives don't need dogs to help them," said Pete importantly. "Let's see." He frowned hard. "Where shall we look first?" "I know," said Billy excitedly. "The deserted house." As soon as he said it, he wished he hadn't. He and Pete hadn't been near the deserted house since the day they had discovered somebody living there, and Billy had no desire to go now. "That might be a good idea," answered Pete slowly. "Maybe not," Billy hurried to add. "Jimmy probably wouldn't have wandered that far away from home." Pete looked at Billy with a half smile on his face. "You scared?" he asked. Billy flushed. Of course not. I was just thinking that maybe we should go in the other direction, down by the river, or... His voice trailed off. Yeah, maybe, agreed Pete. Billy couldn't resist getting back at Pete. You scared? He asked. Me? Pete acted surprised. I'd go to that old deserted house any day, or even at night. But I bet you wouldn't. I would too, Billy retorted. I'll go right now. Okay, let's go then. Frisky tacked along at Billy's heels, not knowing the fear his master was feeling. The fear that whoever had his hideout in the old house would be there when they arrived. Chapter 16, At the Deserted House Again. Billy's heart began to pound wildly when the deserted house came into view through the trees. He glanced at Pete, who was carelessly hitting the underbrush with a big stick he had picked up along the way. I don't think Jimmy would go into the house, Billy said uneasily. He's too little to climb in the window. Maybe if we search the bushes around the house. Yeah, agreed Pete. We'll search the bushes. They both fell silent as they neared the house. Billy had almost forgotten about finding Jimmy. He was only thinking about getting back to the safety of the road that led back to town. As they came around the side of the house, they saw the back door was half open. Frisky sniffed around excitedly, then dashed through the door into the house. Billy gasped. Pete, Frisky went in there, he said in a horrified whisper. Pete nodded dumbly, fear written on his face. I've got to go get him. Then let's get out of here. Billy was glad that Pete followed him into the house. They tiptoed through the kitchen and out into the hall just in time to see Frisky's white tail disappear at the top of the stairs. Billy had never been so scared in his life, but he had to get Frisky. He couldn't leave his pup here with Old Man Hitchcock's ghost, or whatever it was. Frisky began to bark. Billy and Pete took the steps 2 at a time. They had to stop him. They had to get him. The barking was coming from the occupied room. Billy stopped short at the open door. There, on the floor, sat Jimmy. His eyes were red from crying, but he was happy now with Frisky licking his face and jumping wildly about him. Jimmy, gasped Billy, what are you doing here? How did you find the deserted house? Then his eyes caught sight of the rope tied around Jimmy's waist and fastened to the iron bedstead. In an instant, Billy understood. Jimmy hadn't come here by himself. Somebody had brought him. That thought sent shivers up and down Billy's spine. Jimmy, he cried, trying to undo the knotted rope around the boy's waist. We've got to get out of here. His fingers felt like thumbs. Maybe it was because his hands were shaking that he couldn't pull the knot loose. He looked around in desperation. A sound at the door made them both twirl around. There stood an angry man. Billy gasped. It was the strange man he had seen in the park. What are you doing here in my house? He demanded, taking a step toward Pete and closing his big hands around the boy's neck. Frisky, always excited by a scuffle, jumped at the man's heels, barking loudly. When Frisky bit through his trousers, the man let go of Pete and turned on the dog. Pete slipped out the door. Billy couldn't escape because the man was between him and the door. Besides, how could he leave Frisky and Jimmy? Billy's thoughts were all muddled. Then what he saw made him cry out in horror. The man was kicking Frisky with his heavy shoes. Billy covered his eyes. With one last kick, the man sent Frisky flying out of the room and slammed the door shut. Then he turned on Billy. What are you trying to do? He demanded. Steal my boy? Billy's mouth was so dry from fright he couldn't have answered even if he had known what to say. At last I found my boy, and nobody's going to take him from me this time, muttered the man. Now all I have to do is find my wife, and I'll have my family again. Oh boy, and that's where we'll stop. Tune in next time to find out what happens to Frisky and Jimmy and Billy.